Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Can you hear? Now you can hear. I'll start again. So this is about the third introduction I've done in 2 weeks, and I hope you're not bored with me yet. But let me say again, good evening. My name, as many of you know, is Richard Hecht, and I'm the chair of the program committee, which organizes each of the Herman P. and Sophia Taubman Foundation endowed symposia in Jewish Studies lectures here at UCSB. The program for the lecture this evening, this little booklet, it's a wonderful little booklet, describes Sandy Tolan's achievements and the recognition his work as a radio and print journalist has received over the past 25 years. I won't take his time or your precious time rehearsing all of that you've read. I want to introduce him to you in another way. If you want to learn how to write a compelling narrative, read Sandy Tolan's The Lemon Tree. It is compelling for many reasons. Its honesty, its humanity, and its truthfulness. He writes in his acknowledgement that, quote, toward the end of the writing, I began to refer to the book as a living, sentient being. I just love that. A living, sentient being. This goes to the heart of his writing, and I think to the heart of the importance of this book. It is the story, as many of you know, of two people, Bashir Khedri and Dalia Eshkenazi, a Palestinian and an Israeli, and through their two stories, he takes us through Israeli and Palestinian history, a history which is intertwined, interconnected, and I think inseparable. It begins with the father of Bashir building a house for his family in Al-Ramla in 1936, and with the father of Dalia in Bulgaria in 1943 escaping the Shoah because his non-Jewish friends leaked the news of the deportations of Bulgarian Jews to the death camps. In 1948, Dalia Eshkenazi came to live in the house that Bashir had built after the Israeli War for Independence and what the Palestinians describe as the Nakba, the catastrophe. Shortly after the Six-Day War, Bashir and his cousins returned to his family home. The four of them sat in the garden with Dalia, and Tolan writes, quote, Bashir's eyes were like the lens of a camera, taking in exterior walls, window frames, roof line. He recorded soil, sand, branches, leaves, fruit. He even recorded the blades of grass growing out between the layers of stone on the house. Now his eyes rested on the lemon tree, standing in the corner of the garden. Before the three of them left Dalia's home, she gave them 4 lemons from that tree. 6 months later, Dalia followed through with Bashir's invitation to visit him and his family in Ramallah, where they had lived since their exile in 1948. There she learns that the lemon, those 4 lemons, are more than just fruit. They are the history of these two people. There are few people who have told the story of Palestinians and Israelis as powerfully as Sandy Tolan has in this book, through the lives of real people who share a common land. Please welcome a very special guest tonight, Sandy Tolan.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you all for having me here and for coming to listen. And I also want to thank Leonard Wallach and the Taubman Symposia for this invitation. I've been looking forward to it for a long time. I'm going to talk for 40 minutes or so and then look forward to whatever questions you might have. For those of you among us that have read The Lemon Tree, some of what I'm going to say is going to sound a little bit familiar. Some of it will not, but I can assure you that also, even that sounds familiar, hopefully it will be framed in a somewhat different way so that you won't feel like you're just hearing the book again. So I just want to start out by telling you a little bit about how I came to this book. Like many people in this room, perhaps, I grew up with the story of the birth of Israel out of the Holocaust. Not as a Jew, I'm a Midwestern Catholic boy from Irish and German roots, but nevertheless personally in my own community from friends and carpool mates on the way to elementary school. The story I heard was this. In the late 1930s, the mother of my friend Tracy was trying to get out of Amsterdam. They lived in Anne Frank's neighborhood. Her father, an Orthodox Jew, waited in line day after day trying to get a steamship passage. Finally, they got tickets, but the trip was to fall on the Sabbath. And so the father refused them and returned home. His wife and children, including Tracy's mom, were furious. This was an emergency. One can make exceptions when lives are on the line. That ship, the one they would have traveled on, was torpedoed. I don't know how many died. Some weeks later, the family made its way out of Amsterdam after all on another passage, traveling to South America and then eventually settling in Milwaukee, where they became close friends of my parents. So this idea of Israel being a safe haven for Jews that survived the trauma of the Holocaust was burned into me early. From time to time, I would think about it as I rode to school with Tracy. In larger terms, in the larger narrative we tell ourselves as a society here in the U.S., as a culture, you might say most of us who happen to be Jew or Gentile grew up with a version of this story, some far more horrific, some more general. In a way, we might call this the Leon Uris narrative, as told in his mega best-selling novel, Exodus, and then the film with Paul Newman. A version of it, a more merciful kind, lives in the story of Dahlia Ashkenazi Landau, one of the characters at the heart of The Lemon Tree, who in November 1948, 5 years after her family and tens of thousands of other Bulgarian Jews incredibly escaped the Holocaust, lay in a wicker basket at the train station in Sofia as her parents hugged goodbye to relatives and a train clacked and rumbled west to the Adriatic port of Bakr, where a boat would take them to the new state of Israel. There's such power in this narrative. There's such truth in it. But the Exodus story has its limits. As told by Uris, it carries the truth of only one side. And it is simply not possible to understand what is happening in the Middle East today without understanding that there is another side and that it has its own power and truth. And so what I wanted to do with The Lemon Tree and the story of two peoples with common roots in one house, and what I want to do with you this evening in a somewhat different way is to juxtapose the more familiar with the less familiar. For if the dark heart of one narrative is the Holocaust, the dark heart of the other is the Nakba, the catastrophe. If the meaning of 1948 for one side is the War of Independence, the meaning of the other is the Nakba. If the tragic search of the last 60 years for one side is the search for a safe haven from some future Holocaust pogrom or unknown oppression and the wish to return to it, one cannot begin to understand the other side of these two great tragic narratives from these two great peoples without understanding the Nakba. So I'm going to begin on a hot, brutal afternoon in July 1948, in the middle of July, with the Palestinian Hayri family, the family of 6-year-old Bashir, the other character at the heart of The Lemon Tree. It was nearly 60 years ago, just hours after the conquering Israeli army arrived in the Palestinian cities of Lid and Ramleh. Those towns had been designated for the Arab side in the two-state partition, but now, after the Arab side rejected the partition, the future shape of Palestine and Israel was anyone's guess. The boundaries of the state, David Ben-Gurion wrote in his memoirs, will not be determined by a UN resolution, but by the force of arms. So wrote the first Prime Minister of Israel. The Israelis would soon control 78% of Palestine rather than the 54% they were granted in the partition. As we'll see in a moment, the strategic vision for a new Israel did not include tens of thousands of Arabs from these two towns, especially on the corridor between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. And so on that searing July day, thousands of Palestinians, including many in Bashir's family, moved through the hills on foot. Some had been forced to march from the town of Lid at gunpoint. Others, mostly from Ramla, were taken by bus to the front lines of the Arab Legion at Latrun, where they walked in the direction of Salbit, a village to the north. The families had left nearly everything behind: furniture, clothes, pictures, bracelets of coral and amber, orchards of oranges and olives and almonds, fields of wheat, mountain lilies, jasmine, and scarlet anemone, in part because they assumed they would be coming back when the Arab Legion recaptured the towns, but mostly because they had to march through the hills. Bashir's cousin, Firdaus Taji, and other witnesses I spoke with recalled stumbling over rocks, thorns, and wheat stalks cut short from a recent harvest. It was blazing. People began wandering off course in search of any sign of water. One family came upon a cornfield and sucked the moisture out of kernels. Others found an old shallow well with a broken rope. Women recalled removing their dresses, dipping them into the stagnant water, and sucking the moisture from it. One man told me he witnessed people drinking their own urine. Some did not make it. John Bagot Glubb, the British commander of the Arab Legion, whose troops had just retreated from the two towns, heard the reports. It was a blazing day in the coastal plain, the temperature about 100 degrees in the shade, he would write later. Refugees were crossing stony fallow covered with thorn bushes. In the end, Glubb wrote, nobody will ever know how many children died. On July 15, 1948, 2 months after he declared Israel's independence, David Ben-Gurion confirmed the movement of Palestinians through the hills toward Ramallah. He wrote in his diary, the Arab Legion has wired that there are 30,000 refugees moving along the road between Lid and Ramla who are infuriated with the Legion. They are demanding bread. They should be taken across the Jordan River, he declared, meaning to Jordan, where King Abdullah would be saddled with the refugees. Ben-Gurion's quote is important also because it supports the argument that the expulsions from these two towns were part of the strategy of war and state building, and that in strictly military terms, the strategy had logic. Indeed, Yigal Allon, the head of the Palmach, the regular Israeli army, as he chronicled in an article in a military journal later that year, had already considered the strategic advantages of expulsion. Driving the Arabs out of Lid and Ramla would alleviate the pressure from an armed and hostile population. It would clog the roads, seriously hampering any efforts by Glubb's Arab Legion to retake the towns. And the sudden arrival of tens of thousands of destitute refugees in Ramallah would place a huge burden on King Abdullah of Jordan. Perhaps then, from a short-term military point of view, this strategy made sense. But in the spring and summer of 1948, the bulk of 750,000 Palestinian refugees fled or were driven out of their homes. And nearly every one of them, like the child Bashir, would dream of returning at all costs. Their attachment to the land, to the things they left behind, is perhaps the most underestimated aspect of this entire conflict. I've spent so many hours in refugee camps in the West Bank, Gaza, Lebanon, places where the dirt streets are named after Palestinian towns that the grandparents and great-grandparents fled or were driven out of 60 years ago. Haifa, Jaffa, Al-Quds, Ramle, Lid. In the Ain al-Hilwi refugee camp in southern Lebanon, I met an old man who likes to gather his grandchildren to draw the map of a village. Here's the bakery, there's the mosque, here's Mr. Abed's house, a village that has not existed in 50 years. Each year in the memory, the images become more beautiful, the apricots sweeter and heavier, the Arabic script above a carved stone doorway more perfect. In the case of Bashir, he could not stop thinking about the lemon tree his father had planted in the backyard of the family's home. Someday, he knew, he believed he would be coming home to taste its fruit again. Someday the family would return. 4 months later, that boat on the Adriatic, the Pan York, had left the port of Bakr, and on the morning of November 3rd, 1948, it steamed into Haifa port. On board were Moshe and Solia Ashkenazi and their daughter Dalia, 11 months old, in her wicker basket. For so many Jews who arrived on those boats in the early days of the Jewish state, especially those who had lost their entire families in the Holocaust, the sight of the lights on the hill of Carmel above Haifa was overwhelming. People cried, began singing Hatikvah, the old Zionist anthem had become the anthem of Israel, and kissed the ground when they stepped off the gangplank. The Ashkenazis stepped off the Pan York on November 3rd, 1948. On-shore officials of the Jewish agency sat at tables behind a roped line. They took names and years of birth, handed out sandwiches, sprayed the new arrivals with DDT, and put many of them, including the Ashkenazis, on a yellow narrow-gauge train where Moshe, Solia, and Dalia would begin their life in Israel with thousands of other immigrants in the ingathering of nations. The DDT was long before Rachel Carson came along and told us it wasn't a very good idea. It wasn't long before Moshe became restless. In a matter of days, he heard of some new immigrants signing up to move to a town they had never heard of. For the new family, Tel Aviv was not really an option. There wasn't much room left, and Jerusalem was still too dangerous. So why not, he thought. Let us try this town called Ramleh. And that is where, on November 15th, 1948, the young family arrived. Early arrivals to the town would recall to me a place under Israeli military occupation. Some remember belongings strewn in the street. One recalled a burning mattress, another a donkey tied to a post in the front of a house with no front door. Rows of Arab houses stood empty. Moshe and family got off the bus and were met by officials of the Jewish agency. Arriving residents would recall a simple procedure. They were free to choose a house, inspect it, and claim it. Paperwork would come later. I've often wondered, with Moshe and Solia, what was going through their head? Did they wonder who had lived there before? Can you imagine yourself in that place? The family found a house to its liking. It was made of Jerusalem stone. There was plenty of light. And in the backyard, there was a lemon tree. Now, I'd like you to imagine with me for a moment yourself as the child Bashir, growing up in exile, first in Ramallah, then in Gaza. From age 6, for 19 years, all you want to do is go home. Occasionally you wonder, who is in our home? Is it still standing? But you believe it must be. It has to be. It is everything. It is your breath. It is your bread. It is your currency. It is all anyone you know cares about. Return by any means necessary. Now I'd like you to imagine what it would be like to grow up in this town, in this house, having escaped a terrible calamity and knowing only this place as your home from 11 months old. You have a right to be there, you know, because this is your safe haven. It is the only home you know. And who are these people who want to drive you out? Are they the same people who lived in your home before you did? And did they really run away like cowards, as you've learned in school, with the soup still boiling on the stove? Did they really, as one of the textbooks said, prefer to leave? Now imagine being inside that home, 19 years after you have arrived from Bulgaria, on another hot July day after the Six-Day War, when the doorbell rings. Outside the home at the gate, that same gate that his father built in 1936, a man is ringing that bell and wondering who will come to answer it. Imagine being there at that moment. Dalia walked softly down the path to the green metal gate, opened the gate with a large key, and saw 3 Arab men in suits and ties in the middle of the stifling Israeli summer heat, and realized that this was the enemy, literally the enemy at the gate, and knew immediately who these men were and why they had come. This is what she told me later. Across from her stood Bashir. For 19 years, he thought he would be returning home in triumph. Instead, he stood politely at the gate, mustering up the words to ask permission to simply look inside his house. So he tells a stranger who literally holds the key, "This is my Father's house, and I lived here too. And could we come in to see the house?" And now, one more time, if you will, imagine. Just imagine being in Dahlia's place. You're staring at those men. You know who they are. They are your enemy, and you yet sense no threat from them. You should not let them in. You're home alone. Your parents are at work. You're only 19 years old. There are 3 of them, and yet you actually say to yourself, at that moment, it's as if I've always been waiting for them. You could say that this moment, embedded in 60 years of strife, is about enemies facing each other. But in deeper ways, it's not about enemies or hatred or war. It's not about exploding buses in Tel Aviv or helicopter gunships firing rockets into Gaza. It's not about the horror of a young man blowing himself up in a nightclub or a child shot down with a stone in his hand. It's not about that terrible and endless repetition of bloody images, those miles of videotape and forests of newspapers that have fallen and that cause us to say out loud, "Oh, not again. Haven't I read this before?" No. This moment is about something much simpler. It's about home. If you were in Bashir's place on that July day 40 plus years ago, would you have swallowed your pride after such humiliation in the war, boarded a bus with strangers, ridden into your old town, now laced with signs in a strange language you don't understand, and made your way to the front gate, ringing the bell, inviting rejection and denial? If you were Dahlia, facing the enemy at the gate, looking at them as they waited for your reply, would you have had the courage to follow the voice inside you? "Yes," Dahlia said to the 3 Arab men, and she smiled. "Please, come in." So today, I want to talk to you this evening about possibility. If the fabric is dark, if the mutual trauma seems to obscure promise, we can nevertheless look at moments when possibility, chance, hope, at the right angle, in the right light, with the right shifting of the cloth, will sparkle just enough to grab our attention. And so I would like to talk about hope. I would like to even identify it. But first, we're talking about the Middle East. We have the problem of reality. So I will try to touch on both tonight, hope and tragedy, possibility and reality. And then, of course, I'd like to save some time for your questions, too. And in its own modest way, inchoate way, I suppose one possible source of hope, of identifying possibility, is to shift the way we pay attention to the reality. For if we go back to the Leon Uris narrative, I suppose one possible, the birth of it, if we go back to the Leon Uris narrative, the birth of Israel against all odds in a hostile sea, a fragile David amidst the Arab Goliath, we know that this gives us a powerful understanding of reality. But it's not balanced by any understanding of how the other side sees it. So let's look now through the lens of a nation born of the deepest kind of trauma, where never again is the mantra of an entire people. But now let's also pick up the lens of another people, where the Nakba and the love of a home lost lives in the memory, in the blood and breath of nearly every person dreaming about another yet unformed nation. I invite you to do this with me. Of course, to understand the truth and even to be human in this world, we must know the Holocaust. Of course, we must not forget. But what do we know of the Nakba? These two terrible things cannot be compared. They are so different in so many ways. And yet, they each form the dominant narrative of their people in relation to the other. Must we not seek to understand both? Let's dig deeper now, probe further into the layers of sediment of these 60 years. Yes, we know that in November 1947, when the United Nations voted to partition Palestine into 2 states, that the great majority of Jews in Palestine and around the world accepted it and rejoiced. And we know that the Arab side rejected this and pledged to fight it, even to wage war against it. But can we imagine ourselves into the Palestinian point of view during this time? In fact, the Palestinians wanted to know, Why should the other side, with 1/3 of the population owning 77% of the land, be awarded 54% of the land and more than 80% of its cultivated citrus and grain plantations? Some on the Arab side had pushed for an alternate solution, a single state for Arabs and Jews, with a constitution respecting human rights and fundamental freedoms without distinction as to race, sex, language, or religions. Some Zionists on the left, including Albert Einstein and Martin Buber, had also searched for models of coexistence. Einstein called for an ever-present, manifest desire to institute complete equality for the Arab citizens living in our midst. The attitude we adopt toward the Arab minority will provide the real test of our moral standards as a people. And earlier, Buber had advocated a binational state based in part on the love for their homeland that the two peoples share. Nevertheless, we know that Jew and Gentile alike around the world, upon hearing of the outcome of the UN vote, saw it, in the words of historian Michael Cohen, as Western civilization's gesture of repentance for the Holocaust, the repayment of a debt owed by those nations that realized they might have done more to prevent or at least limit the scale of Jewish tragedy during World War II. Can we imagine how the Palestinians felt about this in particular? The Palestinians failed to see why they should be made to pay for the Holocaust, wrote the Harvard Palestinian scholar Walid Khalidi in his book Before Their Diaspora. Why was it not fair for the Jews to be a minority in a unitary Palestinian state, while it was fair for almost half of the Palestinian population, the indigenous majority on its ancestral soil, to be converted overnight into a minority under alien rule in the envisaged Jewish state according to partition? And yes, we know that less than 6 months after that vote in the UN, that the armies of Arab nations crossed the borders of the new Israeli state 60 years ago with the intent of preventing the state from being established. But do we know how the Palestinians living in the cities and villages saw this? Could we see into the hopes of a family like the Khairis, who, terrified by the April 1948 massacre in the village of Deir Yassin, fearful of some reprisal massacre as the Irgun militia pounded Ramla, saw the pending arrival of the Arab Legion in completely different terms? And can we see that when what arrived rather than the Legion was a group of brave but undisciplined, ill-equipped, barefooted Bedouins who used their old rifles to shoot pigeons for food, that seeing this, the idea of a monolithic Arab army poised to defeat Israel ended up to so many Palestinians as a pathetic joke? Yes, we know so well the image of a fragile Israel, tiny in a sea of Arab fury. We know that David Ben-Gurion framed the struggle in 1948 as 700,000 Jews against 27 million Arabs, 1 against 40. But the actual strength of forces on the ground was roughly even in 1948. John and David Kimchi, the Israeli historians, wrote in Clash of Destinies back in the early 1960s that the total strength of the invading armies was 24,000 compared to 35,000 for the Haganah, when the Arab armies initially possessed greater firepower. And we know that Israel gained a significant advantage in firepower after breaking the arms embargo in the summer of 1948. Jumping forward 19 years now, we know of the reports that in 1967, Egyptian forces, 100,000 troops, were poised to attack Israel across the border in Sinai. And we know that throughout Israel, the specter of the death camps in Europe and the fear of another Holocaust gripped and nearly paralyzed an entire people, stoking fears of an Egyptian invasion. But if we dig, we can also learn that U.S. and British intelligence put the number of Egyptian troops at 50,000, and as strictly defensive in nature, and that Walt Rostow, the U.S. National Security Advisor, called the Israeli estimate highly disturbing gambit, intended to influence the U.S. to provide military supplies, and that President Johnson, in a meeting in late May 1967 with Israeli Foreign Minister Abba Eban, said that all U.S. intelligence agencies had concluded that Egypt would not attack, and that if it did, you will whoop the hell out of them. And that Nicholas Katzenbach, U.S. Undersecretary of State, said the intelligence was absolutely flat on the fact that the Israelis could mop up the Arabs in no time flat. Today, 40-plus years later, we know of the Qassam rockets pounding Sderot. We know that 13 people have died there, tragically, unnecessarily, in the last 7 years, and that for those families there can be no consolation, and that for countless of their neighbors, the terror that reignites old trauma, much like in 1967, is impossible to measure. But can we please also imagine what it's like to be a Palestinian in a Gaza refugee camp, when the Israeli military response, known at one point as summer rains, explodes all around you in numbers many times those of the Qassam rockets? Can you imagine losing your own child to what is called collateral damage? We don't have exact numbers of the Israeli strikes compared to the Qassam missile launches, but we can look at casualty figures, for example, for just 1 year. During that year, 21 Israelis died. During the year 2006, 21 Israelis died in attacks by Palestinians. The Palestinian figure, 650. More than half, according to Amnesty International, were unarmed civilians. For other years, years when so-called masterminds on the Palestinian side sent their sons and even daughters in the midst of the innocents to explode themselves, the number of Israeli casualties were much higher. But always civilian deaths among Palestinians in these recent years, and before that, mount in far greater numbers. I mentioned hope, didn't I? What does any of this have to do with hope or with possibility? Please stay with me just a little longer here. Let us look through two lenses now in the efforts to solve this question: the countless UN resolutions, international commissions, white papers, roadmaps. Let us pick one, a fairly recent one, and try to look through both lenses now. In the year 2000, when Yasser Arafat rejects overtures from Ehud Barak and Bill Clinton, and everything falls apart again. In a wave of suicide bombings, Ariel Sharon's visit to Temple Mount Haram al-Sharif, the Al-Aqsa Intifada is born, and Arafat is assigned by many nearly all the blame for failing to compromise. And he certainly deserved a share of the blame. And there's little doubt that Ehud Barak went further than his predecessors. This is the lens, much of it true, that most of us were invited to see through in reams of articles and endless commentaries. But can we pick up the other lens now and try to see it through the Arab side? In the Camp David process, Arafat and the Palestinians had agreed to a single state on 22% of the land they had fought for during decades of struggle. They believed they had already compromised, and that now it was time for Israel to do the same. Late in the Camp David negotiations and discussing the holy sites, President Clinton proposed a sovereign presidential compound for Arafat and his successors inside the Muslim quarter of the holy city to give them access to the holy city. Arafat responded, "So there will be a small island surrounded by Israeli soldiers who control the entrances? This is not what we are asking for. We are asking for full Palestinian sovereignty over Jerusalem, occupied in 1967. Imagine, if you can, being in Arafat's position. For Arafat, it was not just his leadership of his people's struggle for 35 years that prevented him from agreeing to terms he knew that many of his people would reject. It was also his official role in the Muslim world, safeguarding those holy sites. Muslims around the world were paying very close attention. And so Arafat, when asked to concede what he felt was the impossible regarding the holy sites in the Old City, looked at President Clinton and asked at Camp David, "Do you want to come to my funeral?" This is quoted in many of the texts of that time. Last October, while in Israel, I visited Uzi Dayan, the tough Israeli general who was at Camp David, and opposed it from Israel's point of view because he thought they were giving away too much. And yet, we talked about this very point about Arafat. Yes, he told me, well aware how Arafat was cast as the spoiler of Camp David. There was no way Arafat could have agreed to this. And so there was an end of hope in some large way at the end of 2000, the beginning of the Al-Aqsa Intifada, the resumption of suicide bombings, and the obliteration of Palestinian government offices, its modest symbols of security by Ariel Sharon, and then, in September of the next year, the attacks on the World Trade Center, which transformed the region's politics forever. And then a modest, some would say very modest, resumption of that hope with the roadmap and more recently Annapolis. I could go now over the range of peace plans, most of them since 1967, geared toward what we know now as the two-state solution, mostly based on UN Resolution 242 and carrying the names of the cities in which they were conceived amidst great hopes and dreams. Madrid, Oslo, Geneva, Wye River, Taba, Sharm el-Sheikh, just to name a few. But I will only touch on the depressing details of past failures for which I fear are being repeated again today, and I invite more of in our discussion after my formal remarks. For I want now to take you to the land in question, to look at the challenges to resolution through, again, two sets of eyes, and eventually to argue that hope lies in this moment, less in the details of roadmaps, as it does in the possibility of broadening one's point of view and perhaps understanding things in a new way. And I don't mean for just one side. I was last in Israel-Palestine in October during the season of the olives in the West Bank on assignment for NPR, and simply to see what had changed since the end of 2004. It had been nearly 3 years since finishing my reporting and research for the Lemon Tree. And even though I was following the situation closely, of course, I was stunned by what I saw, especially in just how permanent the infrastructure in the West Bank is, the infrastructure that's been under construction by the Israeli army and by settlers. So many more of those smooth as glass, settlers-only roads, expanded settlements perched on hilltops, the 25-foot-high wall slicing through the landscape, well inside the West Bank. In some cases, the wall gives way to layers of electrified fencing, fence after moat after fence after moat, and which has cut many farmers off from their olive trees and other crops, and the hundreds of checkpoints, some of which have been transformed into something akin to international border crossings. I kept trying to imagine these things being dismantled for a two-state solution. One day I rode in a minivan taking Palestinians from the old city to Bethlehem, and after my meetings there on my way back, I got a ride to the wall and gate, which is actually a single-file walkway, perhaps 150 feet long, with high metal bars along its length on either side and above. When you finally emerge through the turnstiles and come out at the other end of the wall, you look back beneath the armed watchtower near the top of the wall to a huge sign in Arabic, English, and Hebrew, "Peace be with you." Is this, I wondered, the future infrastructure of a two-state solution? Or are these the new facts on the ground that seal off Bethlehem from Jerusalem, posing huge obstacles to any meaningful Palestinian state? Even if the political will existed, the immensity of the necessary changes to the land alone is, to put it modestly, daunting. Along with the occupation itself, the settlements are at the heart of the problem in the West Bank, and not simply because there are a few outposts and small enclaves housing ardent aspirants to a biblical view of ancient Israel. We are talking about more than villages. Consider Ariel. This Israeli settlement juts 11 miles inside the West Bank, or more than one-third its width. In other words, deep inside any future Palestinian state. This former outpost is no center for religious fanatics. It is essentially suburban Israel, a small, largely secular city of 18,000 and an easy commute to Tel Aviv. In Ariel, I met a young, friendly, red-haired American, Avi Zimmerman, who, with the blessing of Israeli authorities, regularly travels to Los Angeles, New Jersey, and Florida as part of his recruitment effort to entice American Jews to come to Ariel. Local boosters call the place on their website both a city and a village, with a hometown sort of feeling. Ariel, say its leaders, is here to stay. Given the political atmosphere, there is virtually nothing to suggest otherwise. On most maps I've seen outlining the two-state solution, Ariel is included on the Israeli side of the separation wall. For Palestinians, Ariel is a blade cutting through the middle of their homeland and the Palestinian district of Salfit. If, for example, Osama Oda, a man I met, an electrical engineer and sometime olive farmer, wants to travel the 4 miles from his village of Bidya to visit friends in a nearby village, he must drive about 25 miles, crossing several checkpoints where he will show documents, open his trunk, and face questions about his intentions and past whereabouts. The journey could take an hour or 2, or he might get turned back at the first checkpoint or the third. For villagers without a car, the vast majority, the trip becomes impractical, thus encouraging political and social fragmentation. Multiply this scenario by unknown dozens. Smaller settlements creating similar drive-arounds, Israeli security patrols intended as part of a permanent solution, restricting movement between Palestinian towns, and the ring of massive Israeli suburbs cutting off East Jerusalem from the West Bank. And it's clear that a meaningful sovereign Palestinian state in the current reality is becoming harder and harder to imagine. Proposed workarounds by some Israeli map makers, including dozens of tunnels and flyover ramps and bridges, are not exactly what was envisioned in the original two-state solution. If the two-state solution then does not come about, and I'm not saying it will not, but if it does not, what will? For many Palestinians and a very small handful of Israelis, that is a one-state solution, a politically explosive idea with many permutations. Proponents of a one-state solution say the Israeli occupation is now essentially an annexation, and that the only just solution is to acknowledge that and fight for a single state where everyone will be treated as equal citizens. Some proponents say this must include the Palestinian right of return, which Israelis insist would be the end of the Jewish state. A small minority says, no, you could have a binational state with Israel retaining its inherent Jewishness, but others scoff at this as a dangerous pipe dream. And yet so many of the people who have believed in two states, so many of them are just growing weary and despondent. Like Amin, the East Jerusalem taxi driver who drove me around the West Bank for a couple of days in October, bright, capable, warm, lively, wants to marry his sweetheart from his mother's West Bank village, but she can't live with him, at least for 7 years, while she applies for residency in Jerusalem. And if he goes to live with her in the West Bank, 20 minutes away, mind you, he will lose his Jerusalem residency. So it's love or home, but not both. Or Zahra, from an old and famous Palestinian Jerusalemite family, who for years has believed in encounter with the other side, has spent years of her life engaging, discussing, arguing, dialoguing with Israelis, all in the hopes of a better way for both sides, but who told me over dinner in the old city that she thinks she has wasted her life on this, that she just has just about lost hope and is ready to give up. Or so many of my Israeli friends, 2 of whom, Patty and Golda, long believers in the peace movement and in being part of building the dream of coexistence, have retreated from Jerusalem after 2000 into the Negev desert, working their daily lives in a quieter place with more modest intentions. So if no two-state solution and no one-state solution, what? Some morose realists talk bleakly of a 1.5-state solution, with a lesser occupation, but with Israel retaining control of huge chunks of the West Bank through the wall and patrols of the Jordan Valley and elsewhere in the West Bank. The status quo, more or less, with occasional spurts of violence by the weaker party and massive retaliation by the stronger one. Is that the future? Where the contact between two great peoples is between the bus rider and the bomber, the soldier and the stone thrower, the occupier and the occupied? At dusk one evening in late October, my young friend Amin, the taxi driver, and I were coming back to Jerusalem through the West Bank, where the orange-tiled roofs of the hilltop settlements towered over the whitewashed mosques and stone homes of the Palestinian villages. And there by the side of the road at dusk, we drove past yet another checkpoint. Our plates were Jerusalem yellow, so we could drive past, while the West Bank blues were being required to stop for inspection by Israeli soldiers. And there by the side of the road, as we flashed by, I could see the soldiers had ordered a group of riders out of the van. Excuse me. They were sitting in a row on a guardrail at dusk, heads down, as the soldiers, automatic rifles slung over their shoulders, were inspecting the young men's papers. It was just a small scene, a daily scene, almost mundane now, but no less heartbreaking to me on the 1,000th time than it was on the first. And I thought to myself, something has gone terribly wrong. Not simply with these soldiers and these youths at the so-called flying checkpoint. No, I mean here, the great-grandson of families who had suffered the worst humanity has ever suffered. The grandchildren of the Jews of Yemen and Morocco and Iraq who sought a life here in the 1950s. The daughters of Ethiopia locked in a terrible recurring nightmare with the sons and granddaughters and great-great-grandchildren of Palestine. There is another way. Even though it seems only to ever get worse, there has to be. And so in a rather humble search for anything positive, we can say a source of hope is simply that things must change because the status quo is unacceptable. I realize that in itself is not very encouraging. But what if it is actually not so modest? What if we look at it as a way to recognize the patterns that generate the repetition of history which keeps making everything worse, where both sides are imprisoned, where both sides are, in a sense, walled in by their own history? It's my view that a deeper understanding of history, and particularly the history and experience of the other, is what is necessary for transformative and generational change. Let me tell you another story about Dalia and Bashir before closing tonight. It's a story about that connection, that recognition of history and common humanity. You heard a little bit of it just a moment ago. Bashir, at the end of his visit to the house in Ramallah in 1967, invited Dalia to come visit him in Ramallah one day. And so, on that cold January day in 1968, Dalia and a friend drove through a potholed West Bank to the Khairi home in exile. And there, an abundance of cookies and teas were brought out by Bashir's sister. It was Dalia's first encounter with West Bank women, and for them, very likely, their first encounter with an Israeli not in uniform. And there, the Arab and Jew faced each other, arguing over history. At one point, Bashir stood up and walked to a glass case, pointing inside. "What do you see, Dalia?" he asked. "Oh my God, it's one of the lemons from your visit. But why do you keep it?" "This lemon is more than fruit, Dalia. It is land and history. It is the window that we open to look at our history." And then Bashir told Dalia that one night when he couldn't sleep, he came out to the living room and found his father nearly blind, pacing the floor, tears streaming down his cheeks, a lemon from the tree he had planted gripped in each hand. It was later, 17 hard years and many traumas later, that Dalia decided she had had enough of pain, retaliation, pain, retaliation. She wanted to do something to acknowledge that pain that could address a collective wound. The heart wants to do something, she told herself. The heart wants to move toward the healing of that wound. It was 1985, and with her parents now gone and the house in Ramallah empty — she was living with her husband Yehezkel in Jerusalem — she decided she wanted to do something to acknowledge both histories. Excuse me. So she sought a meeting with Bashir, who she hadn't seen in more than 15 years. They met in Ramallah, and she told Bashir that she had looked into transferring the deed of the house to Bashir, but he was a Palestinian, and legally she could not do that. So she suggested to him, "Perhaps I could sell the house and give you the proceeds." "No, no, no," cried Bashir. "That is our patrimony. It cannot be for sale." "So what shall we do, Bashir?" "I lost my childhood in that home," said Bashir. "I would like it to be a kindergarten for the Arab children of the town." And so that's what it is today. A kindergarten and a house of encounter between Arab and Jew. They agreed to call it Open House. I want to argue that hope lies somewhere in recognizing a pattern, in what lies beneath pain and retaliation, pain and retaliation. Hope lies somewhere in looking past one's own seeming immediate interests to those of the other, and I mean that on both sides. Today, Dalia speaks about what she calls the 3 A's: acknowledgement, apology, and amends, that both sides could demonstrate one to the other. something sweeping and remarkable, something that could actually renew and redefine, that could open the door and remake a home. Let us imagine